Penn State's searching for a number 3 wide receiver. Keandre Lambert-Smith and Trey Wallace have seemed to separate themselves from the pack, but jury's still out on who's going to be that third guy. We're going to figure that out in today's episode, plus some other takeaways from Penn State's final open spring football practice.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Zach Seyko, your host, and Locked On Nittany Lions, now privileged to be partnered with Penn State Rivals. That's right, Locked On Nittany Lions, now your go-to podcast for Penn State Rivals. Visit pennstate.rivals.com. It's your source for everything Penn State athletics. That is pennstate.rivals.com. And this is the final open practice for Penn State football is in the books, where media is allowed to go and shoot and take notes for about 15 to 20 minutes, what you can accurately gather in that span. Plus, you get to hear from James Franklin and some select players and coaches after practice. So J1 Sider, Terry Smith, Adisa Isaac, just to name a few, Harrison Trey Wallace, Fat Man, Katron Allen, and you're going to pick up more takeaways from that, the quotes and the answers to questions that you get from those individuals than you can in 20 minutes. But this episode is going to basically explain everything that was jotted down in a notebook. So I wrote a notebook for pennstate.rivals.com. And just to kind of all the takeaways, everything that I observed from both practice and the interviews. But this is going to elaborate on a lot of those key takeaways. And the first one is the fact that the Nittany Lions do not have a true third wide receiver. And we don't know if they're even on campus yet. So let's start with that. James Franklin, this was most notably coming from the post-practice presser. James Franklin said that Penn State does not have a third wide receiver. He gave praise to Keandre Lambert-Smith, which is good. He's the veteran. He's the old guy in the room. And then Harrison Trey Wallace. Trey Wallace has stepped up in a big way. So those seem to be, and that's been consistent across these. It's going to be 15 spring practices with the blue and white game on Saturday. But that seems to have been the consistent case, where it's been Lambert-Smith, Wallace, and really nobody else. So let's get to the bottom of that. Who could factor in to be Penn State's third wide receiver? And I'm thinking this is coming from the slot. I think Keandre Lambert-Smith is holding down his position as the Z, which is that one boundary receiver. And then on the other side, that's Trey Wallace. That's the guy who came in a lot when they moved Mitchell Tinsley inside. Trey Wallace was usually that guy that came in after and was pretty consistent on the field as a second stringer last year. But this time he seems to have solidified that spot. So I think the third wide receiver spot we have to identify is the slot position. And that's the one that Parker Washington is vacating. And it's a very difficult position. I can't say that it's the most complicated of the three, the X, the Y, the Z. The Y is the slot. And typically your X wide receiver is your number one target. That's your primary target. It's what Jahan Dotson was, and Sean Clifford had that good relationship. You want them to be that number one target that can basically, in this Penn State offense and a Mike Yurcich offense, they have the capability of running option routes. So if I had to say which one was the most important, that would be, but the slot wide receiver, that's supposed to be your go-to, like the tight end. That's supposed to be essentially a safety blanket. And it seems like no one has really stepped up in this case. And when asked about it, James Franklin was specifically asked what players have stepped up. And he just flat out said all of them. It's an open competition for whoever wants to take that third spot. But we know for a fact that Lambert-Smith and Wallace are going to be your two receivers. But who could be the third? If you're looking at the slot receiver specifically, Liam Clifford got on the field quite a bit last year out of that slot position. Is he taking that next step? We don't know, because we don't have too many indicators. Someone else that you could consider is former 4-star, 5-star, depending on what you looked at, and that's Caden Saunders. He's now a redshirt freshman. He's someone that's supposed to factor in the special teams game, maybe be the punt returner this year, and someone that is a traditional slot receiver. Like, he would be the person to put in the slot. Those two players come to mind. Now, if we're going to go across the board here, someone who I've heard a lot of positive things from, special guests like Aeneas Hawkins, has said this quite to me many times. You've heard it from players, particularly Trey Wallace after practice said this to me. I asked him and I said, who do you think is going to be the wide receiver in that third spot, or just who at least has stepped up in your mind? And he was not shy to say Omari Evans. He said Omari Evans has put in the work and has really been the teammate that has stood out to him for that third spot. So Omari Evans will get consideration here, at least just what we've gathered from what another teammate says. Other players that I guess could be factored in, Anthony Ivy. I don't know that Malik McClain would be a slot receiver. He's your 6'4", 220 pounds. Same thing with Malik Mega. Malik Mega is a tall wide receiver. He's going to be more of a guy on the boundary. Would that push Lambert Smith into the slot? It just doesn't seem likely. It seems that Trey is going to be the X, Lambert Smith's going to be the Z, and then the jury's out on the slot, the Y position. But there's also the chance that Dante Cephas, I let off with the fact that this wide receiver might not even be on campus. Dante Cephas, who is committed verbally to Penn State, needs to sign and then needs to get to work right away because he didn't transfer in this semester like Malik McClain did. Dante Cephas is still at Kent State. He's still biding his time. I know he's working on his game as an individual, but has not had the chance to build that chemistry with Drew Aller, and that's very important. So the second he can get on campus for the summer session, Dante Cephas could really shake up the depth chart, and I think that's why you bring a guy like him in. But James Franklin, not hiding away from anything. He says that third wide receiver position is wide open. You could lean Omari Evans, Dante Cephas. He's the veteran. I think he could shake up the depth chart, maybe move some guys around so that the three best guys can get on the field. And that ultimately, I think, will be Dante Cephas, Keandre Lambert-Smith, and Trey Wallace when all is said and done. It is Locked On Nittany Lions. Plenty of takeaways from this final open practice to the media, in both including the media availability and what was witnessed in person for a nice, generous 20 minutes by the Penn State football team. But before we move any further, let's hear from our sponsor of today's episode, and that is Built. Are you looking for a delicious snack but don't want all of the sugar and calories? Then you need to try the best tasting protein bar ever. It's Built. You got to try this. And if you're like me and you want to make healthier snack choices, but you don't want to compromise on taste, I've just got the thing for you. Built Bars and Built Pops. Built Bars are healthy and taste amazing. Seriously, they're so amazing, you won't think they're good for you. That's why you got to try them. And what makes Built Bars so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real dark chocolate. That is right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievably tasty flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, cookies, and cream. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And what's even better is, in fact, they are healthy. Only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering Built bars at Built.com. But now you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and you can get your specialty flavors still at Built.com. That's right. So head to the nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate bar or coconut puff. And if you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box of hit flavors like brownie batter and churro puff. You can thank me later. And thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. Proudly to be partnered with PennState.Rivals.com. Just wrote that practice playbook for Tuesday, April 11th, the final open practice for media. It will conclude with the 15th. All college teams, all football teams get 15 spring practices. And that's what the blue and white game is. It's a glorified spring practice. It's the final one, but now Penn State is actually going to get that traditional blue and white game that I think fans have been craving for a long time. So that's one of the other takeaways. And this is something that James Franklin was very proud of with the opening presser to kick off spring practices. But he alluded to the fact that they would like at the time to hold a traditional spring practice, meaning that you can have some more scrimmages. You're not going to necessarily have just a bunch of drills and players running around for 2 hours, but rather you're actually going to get team drills where you're going to have Drew Aller going against the defense, Bo Prabula, again, all these types of things. I don't know how they're going to keep score necessarily. Scoring might still be, if the defense forces a 3 and out, they get 2 points, that kind of thing. It's not going to be a traditional. I would love it. This is just me personally. I would love it if the blue and white game was an actual pick 'em where you had 2 captains. You had the defensive captain and the offensive captain. So let's just say Keaton Ellis, for example, and Drew Aller. And those 2 guys get to pick teams, and then basically they go out and they compete in a true game-like scrimmage where it's blue versus white. You're not going to get that. It's going to be offense versus defense. But maybe it does go back. So Penn State just hasn't elaborated on what that traditional blue and white game will look like. But now you can have this, and this is the overall takeaway, is the fact that Penn State's offensive line is one of the most talented and the deepest that it's ever been in James Franklin's tenure. This is not an exaggeration. I know this drum is beat every single year, but this is the case. It just is, with the work that James and Phil Troutwine have put in on the recruiting trail. They have finally built a system where they have not only amazingly talented players, from the young guys to the veterans now like Olu Fashanu. They just have it built where they can have 10 different guys. That's what they've said. 10 different guys could see serious playing time that they feel confident in throughout the season. So Penn State fans, if one player or 2 go down, I don't want to say that. I got a wooden desk in front of me. I'm going to knock on it because I don't want to see any of those guys get hurt. But at the same time, Penn State finally has the reinforcements. And why Penn State couldn't do a traditional blue and white game in the past was because of the lacking numbers on the offensive line. You had injuries, you had bumps and bruises, you had guys that couldn't participate. And if you can't, that's the thing. They couldn't even get 5 offensive linemen, 6 maybe, in these past spring games to do these types of things, to hold that traditional game. So fans should be really excited in the fact that the Penn State's offensive line is going to be one of the best. When talking to Katron Allen, he said that he believes Penn State's offensive line is best in the country. No bias from him. But I'm going to tend to believe that if he's confident in the offensive line, and he's that confident, then I'm going to buy into that as well. Another takeaway, let's flip it over on the other side of the line of scrimmage. So where the offensive line has a bunch of depth, the defensive line does not. And James Franklin, not even asked about it, just kind of expressed what he was thinking about the most recent practice for April 11th. And he said that the defensive line just needs depth, and they're probably still looking in the transfer portal. I don't know what reinforcements they could go get, but they're thin. I would say, to go along with that, Zane Durant continues to come a long way. He seems to be the guy that is consistently running with the first team. And again, media members get about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes on a good day to go see once a week what is going on with some of these position drills. And it just seems to be that Zane Durant is always one of the first guys to go, and with the first string defense. So I'm going to buy in that he's going to be a starter this year. I think he's pushing for reps. He's either going to be a co-starter or the true starter defensive lineman. This isn't going to change from John Scott to Deion Barnes. They're going to cycle through. These guys are going to be constantly moving in and out, from Chop Robinson and Disa Isaac to Zane Durant, Devon Elise, Hakeem Beamon, whoever. They're just going to rotate in a lot. So it's a matter of who gets that snap count. But I think Zane Durant's going to have a lot of reps, and he's going to make a lot more plays. But James Franklin definitely addressing that the defensive line is not what it could be and what it should be and what they want for this year. So if there's any weak link on this team outside of special teams, because special teams really does need to sort itself out. We don't know too much else from that. I would say that defensive line, it needs some reinforcements, and they got to find them in the transfer portal before it's too late. I would also add here, if we're talking about defensive starters, maybe there are some guys banged up at cornerback. We don't know necessarily. I'm not going to try to pretend that I do know, but Johnny Dixon was out there with the first group. They were doing some defensive alignment drills. Like I said, Zane Durant was out in the first group. They were looking for gap assignments and just kind of the way the defense has shifted, the way the offensive play was breaking in a hypothetical situation. And Johnny Dixon was out there with the first cornerbacks and Keaton Ellis, for what it's worth. So you get an idea of what the secondary is going to look like on the defensive side of the ball. Let's flip it back over to the offense, because this is just everybody, I think, wants to save controversy. And Drew Aller, Bo Prabula, Jackson Smolik, they are all fine and well. They're healthy. They're all taking equal reps. So, and that goes back to when James Franklin said that he was going to get equal reps for all of those guys. He held true to his word. He stuck to it. Jackson Smolik was throwing at the exact same time as Drew Aller. Sure, there was some rotation for some other drills, but when Penn State could, they had the chance to, they were able to get Drew Aller, Bo Prabula, and Jackson Smolik all throwing at the same time. So there wasn't too much of a preference. And they need to create depth. That ultimately is that takeaway, because if Drew Aller, again, knock on wood, we're not jinxing anything here on this show. But if Drew Aller is not available, that means it turns over to Bo Prabula. And then after that, your backup to Bo Prabula is Jackson Smolik. All three of these guys have to be ready to go in at any given time. They have to be ready, aware, and just know the situation. So there's no time to waste in getting these guys as many reps as humanly possible at the quarterback position. But in terms of some simple timing and throwing concepts, they were able to hit their receivers in stride. Tight spirals, Drew Aller and Bo Prabula looked a little more seasoned than Jackson Smolik. That's not a surprise, but I like the way they all spin the football. They do an excellent job, and they were just in sync with some simple slants, some simple crossing routes, some swing passes from what we saw this past Tuesday. With that, let's move to the final segment of this episode of Locked On Nittany Lions. Again, partnered with PennState.Rivals.com, your go-to source for all things Penn State athletics, and Locked On Nittany Lions, your go-to podcast of Penn State rivals. And I think those are the most important takeaways from everything that was said. Now, this is more of the overarching, the umbrella, and everything that goes along with it. But James Franklin, by Ben Jones. Ben Jones is a very good writer for StateCollege.com, and he was the one to uncork the wine bottle and ask Penn State, the Penn State football coach, James Franklin, about NIL, his thoughts and the approach and everything. And James said, he just paused for a moment and said, it's a very good question. Go check it out. It's on the YouTube page, the full 14 uninterrupted minutes of James Franklin speaking with the media and fielding those questions. But when it comes to NIL, Franklin admitted that Penn State was behind, and that they've been behind, that they're 2 years behind, that there were schools when this became legal in July of 2021, name, image, and likeness, you could pay college athletes. James is not afraid to admit that Penn State was behind the 8 ball in that one. And I'm not here to point fingers. I'm not here to say, well, it's Sandy Barber's fault, or it's Pat Kraft's for not catching up, or anything like that, or it's the Penn State football program because they didn't know what they were doing. Every state had different legislation. So some schools were going to get ahead of it. Some schools were already prepared in the fact of, okay, everyone knew that in some cases, the green light was going to be July 1st, 2021. Well, some schools took advantage of that and said, okay, let's put a plan in place on, start formulating it in March and April of that same year. And it seems to be Penn State didn't do that, or at least Penn State didn't do it successfully. So this is what ultimately, it's a domino effect at this point. So now Penn State is caught up on name, image, and likeness. They're better at it. They're able to recruit better. But there was also the fact of, in this changing landscape of college football, James Franklin also added the fact that Penn State, because they were behind on NIL and playing catch up with other things, and this stems back to facilities. James Franklin admitted this as well, that he said, everybody looked at me crazy for discussing facilities and saying that was an important part of recruiting the best players to Penn State, to Happy Valley, to anywhere. You just need the facilities. That is what matters to these high school football players turning college players. And when you're behind on the facilities, and Penn State was playing catch up in that regard, then NIL shows up and Penn State was behind in that regard. And then it's just kind of the next hula hoop that you have to jump through as a college football program. So Penn State is now above water. They're treading it well. That's what it seems to be. But those things, because Penn State chose to be behind on facilities and then NIL, it's put them in this position that if they want to be a top 10 program, they have to be on par with the way. And that's why you see the recruiting dollars that Penn State invests now. And why is Georgia number one every single year? Alabama. You look at a statistic, I can't exactly remember the publication that put this out, but there was the average spending over the past decade for recruiting dollars, and Alabama and Georgia, it wasn't even close. They had the most money invested in recruiting. So why are Georgia and Alabama always at the top four? Penn State was up there. Penn State was top 10 in spending. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, and all of these other schools, Ohio State, Michigan, but there was definitely a gap between that third and fourth school from Alabama, and Georgia was clearly, I think it was by 5 million or so on average that they were ahead. So James Franklin had his criticisms, but said that Penn State is doing the right things. He also said this, that Penn State, along with other universities, this is just in general, that you don't get to pick and choose what you want to be good at. And this is what stuck out to me. I thought this was very insightful from Coach Franklin, was the fact that he said that in college football, you don't get to pick and choose what you want to be good at to be a top 10 program. The market sets the criteria. I hope I'm making sense here, because it made sense to me when Franklin was saying it to all of us. The market of college football sets the criteria, and that's the same thing. The players, the people that are committing to these institutions, they set the market. They set the demands of what they need from a college program to commit. So as a Penn State board, as people who support the program and want Penn State to be one of the best in the country, you can't say, well, we want to be good at this, when that's not what matters at the end of the day to the general public. That's just not what matters. So when all's said and done, you're going to have to meet the list of expectations that these high school players and the market that is driving it. As Penn State, yeah, I totally understand success with honor. It is a little weird paying high school athletes. It's not, and new college athletes. It's not the same anymore. This is a different world when it comes to college athletics, but it is here. You can't ignore it. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. And that's what Coach Franklin is saying. You have to meet the demands of the market, or else you're going to be left behind. And you can't be, scratching your head saying, well, how is Penn State not a top 10 program? We have a great coach. We have great relationships. We do this, and this. But that is not what makes a great college competitive football program. That's just it at the end of the day. So I'm not going to continue to beat a dead horse from that. It was nice to see Coach Franklin be transparent about his thoughts on NIL. He doesn't keep them hidden from anybody. And to say that to the media, I think it's also a message to people to just keep up the pace. And he said this too. He wants to put the pedal to the metal. He wants to floor it when it comes to NIL. You can't just meet one goal and say, all right, we're done. We don't need to do anything else. That's it. That you have to keep up with it, because the next obstacle, the next challenge is going to continue to come with this ever-changing market now that the floodgates are completely wide open. So those are all the takeaways that I had from my practice notebook. One final thing, just a couple little things, right? Christian Driver, son of former Green Bay Packers wide receiver, and that is Donald Driver, very good friends with James Franklin, I might add. It seems that the younger Driver has fully transitioned to wide receiver and is not going to be a defensive back. He is going to be a wide receiver. As he was taking wide receiver reps with the group. And maybe he's in the third wide receiver competition. Who knows? James Franklin said it was completely wide open. And then the running backs, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen at the Blue and White game. They were there. They were practicing in full. And that's the ultimate takeaway, is that none of those guys that are hurt. All 5 of those running backs that are currently on campus, excluding Trey Potts, who is transferring in, Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, Emil Davis, Tyler Holtzworth, Tank Smith are all healthy and available. Just in terms of avoiding some bumps and bruises, expect to see a heavier dose of Davis, Tank Smith, Holtzworth. Those are just the guys you're going to see, because you want to protect Singleton and Allen because they have Heisman potential. And that's the last thing you need is a fluke injury in spring. So it is Locked On Nittany Lions. Thanks so much for joining me on another episode. Be sure to continue to subscribe and follow along with the channel. So close to 1,000 subscribers. I appreciate all the support on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. More episodes are on the way, as the Blue and White spring game is going to be a highly anticipated event for recruiting. Recruiting is crucial here. It's one of the big events to get the next wave of players to Happy Valley, to Penn State. We're going to bring back on Dylan Callaghan Crowley to to analyze all the recruits and the big names that are going to be there on Saturday, plus so much more. It'll all be right here on Locked On Nittany Lions.